Welcome back to Recruiting Blitz. As always, I'm Tim Verghese. Appreciate you guys tuning in. Before we get started, be sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel. A bit of a short one today, just kind of running through kind of what's happened in the last week. We didn't really touch on the transfer portal last week, just as Nebraska kind of puts the finishing touches there. Now, at the end of the week, we're sitting here. Nebraska missed out on Jonah Wilson. He went to Texas A&M. Ultimately, that came down to a case of roster spots and scholarship spots. Nebraska didn't have a scholarship spot to offer Wilson. The plan was he was going to be a walk-on for the spring semester. Work through the spring and if he decided to stick around, would be turned into a scholarship player when the scholarship limit increased to 105 in the summer. As you guys know, for the spring, or you may not know, the scholarship limit here for the spring is still 85. Once we get into the summer, into the fall, that's when teams have to kind of adhere to that 105 uh, total man roster limit, which means all 105 members of the roster have to be on scholarship, but you can't have any more than 105 uh, members of the roster, essentially eliminating the walk-on program. So, of course, what that's meant for Nebraska has been, the spring is essentially a process of whittling down. Right now, the roster, they're right at 85 scholarships, but they have, 30, 40 plus walk-ons kind of still in the program or non-scholarship players still in the program. They've got to whittle down. I think it's closer to 20, 30 now. I don't have the exact numbers off the top of my head. There's a few names we're not 100% sure on right now, whether they're returning for the spring or not. So kind of dealing with that, but I think the number's closer to 20, 30. They still have to whittle down here in the next few weeks before the end of the semester, essentially. And so what you're going to see, I've mentioned this in a couple of places now, what you're going to see is a spring ball that somewhat replicates like an NFL training camp where there are going to be unfortunate cuts at the end of spring, even during spring, just the way the calendar works out. Nebraska is going to have to deal with spring ball in the middle, or the transfer portal. The spring transfer portal window opens in the middle of spring ball, specifically towards the back end of spring ball. So I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, you've already seen Arizona cornerback Marquise Gross-Killebrew had committed to Nebraska out of the portal, ultimately decided to withdraw from the portal and return to Arizona, basically, ending his commitment to Nebraska. Already, kind of with the room where it was at with three additions to the portal, 20 plus names on the roster, a good group of underclassmen. Competition is just really stiff right now. And especially with the news that Deshaun Singleton is returning for the 2025 season, you're going to see stuff like that where a guy joins, for the spring and potentially out before the spring even ends, or a player commits, even a year ago through the transfer portal and he doesn't last, more than a year with the program. That's just kind of the case now as Nebraska has to whittle down this roster down to 105. It's going to be some decisions they may not want to make. If it was up to Matt Rule and his staff, he'd want to keep everyone around, but as things stand, they have to get down to 105. And so that's a process. Over the next few weeks, we'll be talking plenty about names that could be on that list. Names kind of on that bubble, I guess, in each position group. I think you're going to start to see more of that discussion here, in the next few weeks as we start to turn the page and look ahead to spring ball. But yeah, on that note, talking about the transfer portal, Nebraska did miss out on Jonah Wilson, like I mentioned, again, a scholarship issue. But they also missed out on Shiyazh Pete. That was an offensive tackle target from New Mexico State. They were down. It was Michigan, Kentucky, Nebraska, Oklahoma State was involved. Vanderbilt was involved. Ultimately committed to Kentucky. And this wasn't an NIL thing, as I mentioned, I think in a previous show. Nebraska had a pretty competitive offer out there for him, as did Michigan. Very much in the range of what a starting tackle in and the Power Four level would get. Kentucky had a pretty competitive offer out there too. Didn't come down to that. Ultimately, came down to where he wanted to play, what he wanted to do. Kentucky's quietly kind of put together a really nice offensive line through the transfer portal. And I think the opportunity to kind of play with them and play in the SEC ultimately stuck out to him. And so Nebraska misses out. They'll have the spring again to address the second tackle spot if they want to. Obviously, having already added Elijah Pritchard from Alabama, they'll have the second transfer window to potentially address another tackle position, or try and add some depth or a spot starter on the interior of the line. I think ideally they'd like to add a center or a guard if possible. If they can find a quality starting right tackle, or starting tackle in general, to kind of give them some assurances that they won't have an unexperienced or inexperienced tackle stepping up to protect Dylan Raiola next season. As of now, I think it's going to be Gunnar Gatula at one tackle spot. I think it's going to be or Teddy Prohaska, depending on his recovery. I think it's going to be Elijah Pritchett at the other tackle spot. How those spots figure themselves out, I think it's going to have to come down to the spring. Pritchett played right tackle last season, but has played left tackle in his past, is more familiar on that side of the ball. For his sake, from a consistency standpoint, it might even be better for him if he moves back over to the left where he's a little more comfortable and where he kind of developed as a tackle. So that's again something for the spring, a storyline to keep an eye on in the spring. But that about does it in the transfer portal here for Nebraska at this point. Coming out of the winter, they made 15 total additions, three defensive backs, three wide receivers, three defensive linemen. You saw two linebacker ads. Special teams, they added a punter, they added a long snapper, they added a backup quarterback, they added an offensive tackle, like I mentioned. They did a good job in addressing the needs and, backfilling and ensuring, in places that they lost some depth, they added some depth in. You could argue, I kind of mentioned in the past, but, you could argue regarding the defensive side of the ball. They're not as deep as they once were, but from a top end standpoint, you like the addition of Williams and Renari. You like the addition of Jalen George as a rotational pass rushing end. Whatever Gabe Moore becomes, on the interior, he's got a good frame, has good high school film, but obviously hasn't played. In 2 seasons at Mississippi State. Linebacker, you love the addition of Deshaun McCullough. I think it's just a sign that they're trying to move into this positionless type defense, and I think he's a guy that kind of unlocks another level of that for the defense and kind of unlocks a lot of things that John Butler can do, kind of creatively to address. Some of the mismatches they could potentially face next season, some of these unique one-on-one matchups that they can have Deshaun now kind of take and eliminate in one-on-one situations. And so, you like the addition there. Marquise Watson Trent at linebacker is a massive addition. The linebacker room isn't as deep as maybe as it once was, but you like the top end talent in that room at this point, with the return of Javen Wright as well. Defensive back room, again, you lost some depth, you lost some veteran leaders, but you got better athletically. Nebraska got, they wanted to get athletes in that room, they got better athletes. And then on top of all of that, offensively, you can argue no position improved more through this winter transfer portal cycle than the wide receiver room. The addition of Dane Keene, Isaiah Hunter, Hardley Gilmore, plus Cortez Mills from the high school ranks, Isaiah Mosley from the high school ranks. That room's taken a complete turnaround. It's going to be a completely different group of pass catchers out there for Dylan Raiola. I think, I'm going to say this now too. I think the top three receivers next year for Nebraska, or top four receivers, three of the top four receivers for Nebraska next year are going to be new names to the program. I think Ja'Cory Barney is still going to be in that top group, one of the top receivers. But I think Dane Key, Isaiah Hunter, Hardley Gilmore, Cortez Mills, one of those guys, potentially Mac Markway, a tight end, or another tight end breaks out. I could see, distributing the ball. Nebraska has options now. They're going to have to be able to kind of rotate a lot more and more closer to what Dana Holgerson and Dakiel Shorts want that room to look like and how they want them to rotate. I think that's what you're going to see moving forward, is a room that rotates. They like to go 7-8 deep if possible in the receiver room, and I think that they have that opportunity now with the additions to the room. Switching gears a little bit, kind of talking about the last week on the recruiting trail. Nebraska was back on the road, and I just wanted to touch on, no specific offers because they're doing their due diligence. They're working to get guys in town for that Feb 1st Junior Day. I think you're going to see more names pop up here on the Inside Nebraska Insiders board and on InsideNebraska.com. Some new names added to that visitor list here this week. We're checking in with top recruits across the country on their visit plans. And so I think you're going to see an update here soon on some potential names to keep an eye on. But as Nebraska kind of doing their due diligence there, they're also making a bunch of new offers in the 2026, 2027, and 2028 classes. They've offered a ton of 2028s as of late, kind of getting ahead with some current high school freshmen. Again, a long, long way to go with 2028 class, the 2028 class of recruits. I think most of those guys are 2-3 years away from making a decision, but it is important that Nebraska gets out ahead early for established young recruits, makes sure their names in the mix, make sure they're relevant. And I've said this before, and I'll continue to say this. Even with 27 and 26s, it means a lot. Recruits, it does mean a lot for them when school is one of the first programs to offer. Those first 5 offers or so really hold a lot of weight. that first offer, obviously, Nebraska's been in that situation where they've been the first offer for a number of recruits, and it's led to commitments. It's led to, they're at the table at the very end. They do a good job of maintaining relationships. And so you're going to see all of that continue. I don't think that's going to change, even as a result of the transfer portal and kind of the shift in, staff philosophy and what they're doing. But what you're starting to see a shift in and something new, I guess we can touch on here. Is an expansion, just in terms of the footprint, where Nebraska is reaching out, where they're finding talent from, and where they're offering talent. It felt like at one point here in the last couple in the over the last year or so, it felt like at times Nebraska was fully making that pivot to focusing solely on the 500-mile radius. Getting out to Chicago, getting out to Denver and the Colorado area, getting out to the Dakotas and Missouri, Kansas. Recruiting the region really hard and landing the top talent in the region. And while that's important and while that still remains a focus from the staff, I think you're starting to see with the addition of Philip Simpson and Addison Williams to the staff, with the addition of Jamar Mosley, with some of these relationships they've added to, or relationship builders they've added to the staff, they have the ability to go national again. They don't have to focus solely on the 500-mile radius. And while that's important, that 500-mile radius and locking that down is important, and they're taking meaningful steps to increase their footprint in Chicago, to increase their footprint, in Minneapolis, in Minnesota, increasing their footprint in St. Louis, obviously, and Kansas City. While all of those things are important, in this day and age, you have to be a national team, especially in the position Nebraska's in, where they don't really have, this backyard of talent to pick from. I think you're going to see less and less swings in state. I don't think there are that many options like there once were for Nebraska in the state of Nebraska, especially in the state, in their home state, especially with this roster cut down. You can't really take swings on unproven talent, and potentially run the risk of, hey, you land this kid or this recruit, from Omaha Burke, and it doesn't really pan out. He ends up in the transfer portal after a semester or two. You've burnt a bridge at Omaha Burke, and Nebraska is kind of going to be mindful of that moving forward in terms of how they balance this. And they're only going to, with in-state prospects, they're really going to offer and try and land guys they for sure think will play at the program. They don't really have the opportunity, and it's the reality of the sport. If it was up to Matt Rule, this wouldn't be the case. It was up to the staff, it wouldn't be the case. But ultimately, I think what you're going to see is less of a focus on in-state prospects unless they're surefire, top end talent. You look at the 2026 cycle. Nebraska really currently only has two committable offers in the state of Nebraska, two in-state prospects. It's Isaac Jensen, the three-star tight end at Millard South, and Jace Reynolds, the linebacker at Elkhorn North. It's those two pretty much in-state in 2026. You look ahead to 2027, you have a couple more options. Torrey Pittman's one of the top safeties in the country out of Omaha Central. Kylan Haney is a top running back. Matt Erickson, the offensive tackle out of Millard West, and so Nebraska's not necessarily shutting the door on in-state prospects by any means, but they don't have the opportunity now to take risks and take swings on in-state talent like they used to because of the roster cutdowns. And so what you're seeing, and the point I'm getting to, what you're seeing is they are expanding into some new territories. We saw a bunch of new offers in Arizona. Why Arizona? There's some connections there with the staff. One, Keith Williams has some good relationships down there. Dylan Raiola, from his time playing down there, has some good relationships. His uncle Donovan Raiola on staff also has some good relationships down in the area. But it's also an area that's growing in talent. You're seeing a number of, obviously they call them snowbirds, but kind of people moving down from all walks of life, kind of moving down to avoid the snow. But they end up setting up shop in Arizona now, and you're seeing the rise of kind of some power high school programs in the state of Arizona, specifically in bigger cities outside of Tucson, outside of Phoenix, in those general areas. And so you're seeing some new offers out there. It also helps for Nebraska. Millard South, as I mentioned, the in-state program, they played in Chandler, Arizona, at Basha High School, a powerhouse program down there. Basha is actually coming up to play Nebraska here in the 2025 season. So they're going to be in Omaha the first weekend of the high school football season here in Nebraska. I'd expect if Nebraska can get it done, they have offers out to three players at Basha right now. Three, I believe, as we speak. If Nebraska they want to get those guys on campus, while they're in the state, while they're, within a driving distance from Lincoln. They want to get those guys on campus in Lincoln. They want to have them down for visits, and we could very well see that happen when Bosher comes to town here in a couple months. So keep an eye on that. But Arizona is a state that I think Nebraska is going to continue to recruit, continue to try and make a living in. Again, not necessarily land, 5, 6 recruits per cycle or anything, but they'll spot recruit. They'll try their hand at top targets down there, top recruits in the state. Another area you're starting to see them expand into is Charlotte. Obviously, last cycle they tried and tried on 5-star offensive tackle David Sanders. Ultimately, lost out to Tennessee despite a strong late push from Matt Rule and his staff. And then you look ahead to 2026. They have an offer out to Jamal Rule, a 3-star running back out of Charlotte Christian. That's a guy that's steadily rising up the board for EJ Bartel. That's a guy that Bartel. I could very well see him in the class as a second back at this point. I think Nebraska is one of the one of the schools to beat at this point in his recruitment. They made a couple new offers. Trayshawn Ruffin, a 3-star Texas A&M defensive line commit, out of North Dublin, North Carolina. They offered Xavier Griffin Haynes, an elite edge rusher, out of Rolesville, North Carolina. 2026 4-star defensive lineman Keyshawn Stansel, out of Clayton, North Carolina. And again, it's spot recruiting. It's not necessarily a state that Nebraska's going to land 5, 6 plus guys out of, but there's a lot of trench talent specifically coming out of the state of North Carolina right now, specifically in the greater Charlotte area. And Nebraska's, trying to work themselves into that mix. They have a couple of relationships there from Matt Rule's time with the Panthers. Obviously weren't in the high schools like that, like they would be if they were coaching college out there. But there's some relationships out there. There's some familiarity out there. I think more than anything, it kind of shows a lot of schools are trying to, work themselves into the Carolinas and land talent out of the Carolinas. Nebraska's very much trying to be one of those schools as well. So we'll see what happens there. That's kind of a work in progress of in terms of relationship building. And you're also seeing over the last week a growth in Georgia, specifically once again in the trenches, offensive line, defensive line. You saw a bunch of new offers to 26 and 27 defensive ends, defensive linemen, and offensive linemen out of the state of Georgia, just running some names off. 2026 Great Atlanta Christian 4-star edge Dre Quinn. Nebraska was the 25th offer for him. 2026 Norcross 4-star defensive lineman Carter Lucky added a Nebraska offer. 2027 Atlanta Pace Academy 4-star edge rusher Justin Weeks added a Nebraska offer. 2027 Roswell Trinity Catholic 4-star edge rusher David Jacobs added a Nebraska offer. In 2027 Stone Mountain Stevenson 4-star edge rusher KJ Green, one of the top edge rushers in the country, added a Nebraska offer. And you've seen a couple more in the state. And again, it's a state Nebraska's familiar with. They've landed recruits out of in the past. It's not anything new for them, but they're expanding their footprint in Georgia. They're trying to make Georgia more of a priority. Part of that is Addison Williams. He's from UCF, has recruited Georgia, has good relationships up there. Jamar Mosey as well. Philip Simpson from his time at Florida State, and his time just in the Southeast region, has some good relationships as well. So you're going to see those three kind of lead the way for Nebraska in Georgia. Obviously, Matt Rule's going to be involved as well. But and I will say this too, something notable to keep an eye on here. Terry Braden still coaching Kansas City through the playoffs. Had a nice performance. Nebraska looked to capitalize off of that. As the Chiefs defensive line kind of had their way with the Texans offensive line here this past weekend. A good recruiting tool for Nebraska to kind of use that. And you've seen those graphics circulating on social media of what Braden's defensive line with the Chiefs did this past week. But Braden's kind of doing double duty right now. Obviously, he's on staff. He's with the Chiefs right now, trying to lead them to another Super Bowl, or trying to help them to another Super Bowl. But he's also, this week or the last 2 weeks or so, we've seen some new offers go out, specifically listing Braden as the guy offering. He's not on the road recruiting. He can't do that just yet. But he is, making phone calls, in communication with recruits, starting to get an idea of what a board looks like, and putting together his recruiting board. He's got to work fast because he's a new college coach, kind of figuring out the ropes of college recruiting. It's something new for him coming from Kansas City. But he's got an established board. He's got some help on the staff with Philip Simpson. Matt Rule's a defensive line guy himself. And Addison Williams, John Butler, all helping out as well. But he's starting to get his footing, and he's starting to make some offers, and I think you're going to start to see him kind of develop, just the same way Terrence Knighton developed as a recruiter. I think you're going to see Braden develop as a recruiter. Already talking to recruits, they could appreciate, kind of his body of work, but also kind of talking to him in the early impression they get. Is a guy that they feel comfortable with, is a guy that they trust, and talking to people in the know with Braden, they're confident in his ability to build relationships and mold young minds and kind of work his way up the ranks, and so that's a young staffer to keep an eye on. Obviously, the new defensive line coach, and he hasn't stepped foot on campus just yet or settled down on campus just yet, but already starting to get his wits about him, starting to figure things out. So yeah, that's going to be the story of the offseason, I think, is how these new coaches adjust, both to recruiting and to, kind of the new reality of college football, how they, develop the room they have. They're going to need some development in the defensive line room. You're going to see some development in the defensive backs room. Addison Williams has his hands full as they look to replace, some starters at the position and bolster some depth. So again, work in progress. I think all of these rooms are a work in progress. But it's coming together slowly but surely. I, for one, as a recruiting reporter, kind of appreciate the slowdown of the transfer cycle. It was a little crazy there for a bit. Appreciate y'all tuning in and following along for all of our content through all of that. It was a bit of a mess, of course, at times, but we got through it, and we're going to do this all over again in the spring, which I'm excited for. Once we get a couple of months off of transfer portal reporting, I'm excited for that. But that'll do it for us. I appreciate y'all tuning in. Like I said, bit of a shorter episode this time. Just kind of touching on, some new things. We'll have probably a better episode, more loaded episode next week, ahead of the the Feb 1st Junior Day, kind of running through some of those key names, some of the important visits to know, and kind of what to look for that weekend. Any guys that could be on commit watch. That list is going to come, come together by next week, I expect. So stay tuned for that. We'll be back very soon. And once again, appreciate y'all tuning in, and we'll be back very soon.